Hurricane Harvey Safety and Cleanup webinar. This is a complimentary webinar provided by the Restoration Technical Institute and our instructor, Destry Ransdell of Tech Pro. My name is Lisa Lavender, Chief Operating Officer of the Restoration Technical Institute and also Berks Fire Water Restorations. I would like to take this opportunity to thank Destry for giving of his time and expertise to present this webinar. It is being recorded and will be uploaded on YouTube tomorrow for those who would like access to it. Destry is an IICRC instructor, certified master textile cleaner, water restorer, and fire and smoke restorer. He's been the director of health and safety for many employers, and he's spent many years in the restoration industry in various capacities. And so without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Destry. Thank you, Destry.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Lisa. Good afternoon, good evening to everyone. Thank you for the opportunity to be able to put together this presentation in regards to the Hurricane Harvey happening in the Houston and Louisiana area. We'll go ahead and get started. Just to kind of give you an idea of what I put together here, this is just going to be in regards to basic health awareness, the basic cleanup procedures and awareness. Any additional or specific questions can definitely be answered upon request. As we go through the presentation, we'll first start with the safety and health concerns, proper cleanup remediation procedures, as well as selecting a qualified contractor. We'll then follow up with any questions and answers. I ask that if you do have any questions during the presentation, that perhaps you can list those in the chat box if you have that open, or make note of those so that we can proceed with the presentation. I do have time allotted for those questions and answers towards the end. Hopefully we can get to those. There is contact information that I posted at the end of the presentation that we can definitely forward any additional questions that you might have. In regards to health and safety, whenever we have an occurrence of any type of water damage, especially when it's dealing with the contaminants to the level that we have with the hurricane, you always want to consult with your primary health care physician. This is going to be in regards to workers and the occupants of the structures. The recommendations because of the occurrence would definitely be a tetanus. Also, with consulting with your primary health care physician, it would be important that perhaps you go through a pre-screening procedure. This would make your physician aware of what the project would involve, or the details of the project, whether you are the worker or the occupant. You want to document or have documentation of your current health status. And then you also want to list your physical abilities. Projects and working in these locations, working in these atmospheres can definitely cause for additional stress and fatigue to the individual. And then it's also recommended that you consult with your primary healthcare physician in regards to post-screening. You would follow up with your health and then also discuss potentially whatever your physical abilities might be at that time. With the health and safety definitely involved in these matters, and there's been several news publications in regards to the drinking water. You do not want to drink or use the tap water until it's been deemed safe. So it's important that we have sufficient supply of bottled water, sufficient supply of potable water as well. This would be used for drinking as well as cleaning or decontamination, washing of your hands, your face. It's important in these crises or in these situations that you have that ability. We also want to be concerned with any heat-related illness. In the Houston area, Texas area, the Louisiana area, anywhere in the Gulf Coast, this time of year, heat would definitely be a concern. OSHA has information specifically regarding heat. I recommend that you can go to OSHA's website. It's OSHA.gov. They have an app that can be downloaded to your phone, whether you have an Android device or an iPhone device. and that is the OSHA Heat Safety Tool. What this allows you to do is indicate the temperature, or input the temperature, input the relative humidity, and it will provide you with a feels like or a heat index temperature. OSHA, when it comes to the health and safety in regards to temperature, has a lot to say with how often we should be taking drink breaks or breaks from the work activity. And this is something that should be monitored closely because of the heat exhaustion or other heat-related illnesses that could definitely occur in these areas. Additional health and safety would be your stress and fatigue. In a normal circumstance, stress and fatigue is definitely going to be an issue. But when you go out to a project, when you're going out to respond to events such as these, the hours of which an individual will likely work is definitely going to increase. This is something that you always want to be aware of. An individual should be monitoring this, because when you become stressed, when you become fatigued, you're going to be more susceptible to injury. You're definitely more susceptible to illness. With fatigue, with stress, this can definitely weaken your immune system, and you're in an environment that is definitely going to be heavily contaminated with pathogens and other concerns. So this is definitely going to be difficult to avoid considering the circumstances. Those individuals who are more likely going to be more susceptible without any additional factors would be elderly, children, immune compromised, and pregnant women. These groups of individuals all have a weakened immune system. Whether you're an occupant and you fit into one of these categories, or you're a worker and fit into one of these categories, it's definitely something to be alerted to. The personal protective equipment. This is going to be for any individual that is involved in the inspection process, or an individual that is working in the remediation or mitigation procedures. So this also is going to include any temporary labor. In circumstances such as these, I know there's a mass influx of temporary labor that is utilized. This is a question that I'm typically asked, and we need to ensure that their health and safety is attended to just as if they were a mandatory employee that would work for you on a daily basis. We want to discuss, and you also want to train them for the proper donning and doffing procedures. It's important to understand that each time they exit the contaminated area, so if they exit the contaminated structure or the work area, that they remove their personal protective equipment, they dispose of it properly, and then they replace it with new prior to re-entry to that work area. The proper donning and doffing procedures, information such as this, can be found by going to OSHA's website. And this is also an additional location that anything having to do with PPE can definitely be found. Specifically to inspections, just to keep it fairly basic, because there's a broad range of inspections, and without knowing exactly what's being inspected, you want to cover all potentially exposed areas. The level of contamination, because nothing is going to likely be disturbed during the inspection process, won't be as great as far as what's being aerosolized, but it's also important to cover any area of the body or of the person performing that inspection, so that they're not coming directly in contact with the contaminated liquids, water, or surfaces. So this can include, but not limited to, the PPE for removal. In the removal stages, so the remediation and removal stages of the project itself, I've added some specifics to this. It's recommended that the individual, the person performing the services, have a hooded and booted moisture-resistant suit. You might find this listed or noted as a protective coverall that has attached head and foot protection. So this would be a disposable coverall, a protective clothing, some item that has the attached head and foot protection to it. With your hand protection, this is going to vary based upon the activities, whether you're cleaning, you're performing a removal. It's important that in any of the procedures, your base glove would be a large cuffed nitrile glove. If you were to do a search on any type of supplier and you did a search on their website for large cuffed nitrile gloves, many different examples would definitely be available to you for this item. We recommend that during the removal processes or handling of specific materials, debris materials especially, that you want to use cut-resistant gloves. The cut-resistant gloves are generally going to be placed on over the top of your large cuffed nitrile gloves. The respirator should be a NIOSH approved. Actually, the terminology for that is a shall. It shall be a NIOSH approved full face respirator. You should be using an organic vapor with a P100 cartridge. The organic vapor is going to be for any odors that are present, which is definitely going to be the case in circumstances such as these. The P100 is for the particulates. It's for anything that's aerosolized. The P100 is a HEPA portion of the cartridge. So at a minimum, the cartridge that will be attached to the full face respirator is an organic vapor P100. And then during your remediation procedures, if you are choosing to use some types of antimicrobial biocides, may fall into the classifications as an acid gas. So the AG-OVP100 cartridge is recommended for the respirator at that time. The AG stands for acid gas, and then you follow up with the organic vapor and the HEPA portion of the cartridge. It's important that you have a medical evaluation. This is actually a requirement, so this is a shall. Any individual that is going to be donning or wearing or using the respirator shall be in compliance with OSHA's respiratory program. I put in parentheses here, this includes your temporary labor. So we fit them for the protective coveralls, but we also need to go through the procedures of fitting them for a tight-fitted respirator. The OSHA respiratory program is going to start with the medical evaluation. Once successfully completing or passing the medical evaluation, they'll follow up with the fit test. The certified fit test can be completed by individuals within your company. You'll go through a documentation procedure. If you were to purchase a fit testing kit online by any type of supplier that we could use within this industry, it will come with the instructions and the document that needs to be filled out per individual for that face piece. We then complete the process by documenting the training. Within the training, you're going to show them how to properly use it, how to properly care for it, how to properly decontaminate it, and then how to properly store it. It's also important to train them to ensure that the seals and the proper gaskets are in the proper location. Additional information for this can be found either by going to OSHA's website or speaking directly to your supplier of these personal protective devices or personal protective equipment. It's also stated that rubber boots with a steel toe and also a steel insole should be used. Hearing protection and NIOSH approved head protection. An example of that would be a hard hat. What I've listed here would be your minimal recommendations for PPE. Just to make a comment or a side note, we've seen probably some pictures on the news or in magazine articles or in any type of publication, and what we have likely seen is individuals not in PPE. I'll back up one slide. So in regards to OSHA's respiratory program, this is not going to be a requirement for any individual who is a volunteer. And in most cases, what we're seeing currently on the news or what's been in publications that I have viewed, individuals have either been in a paper mask, a dust mask, nothing at all, shorts, tennis shoes. I would identify these individuals as volunteers. It's important to use engineering controls, definitely in these situations of extensive contamination. However, we do not want to use any electrical that has been underwater prior to inspection by a qualified individual. That qualified individual would definitely be an electrician. This is something very important because of the risk of fire hazard, as well as If you do have standing water, and you feel as though it is higher than any electrical outlet or switch plate, etc., they make a voltage detector. It's called a hot stick. You can simply wave this over the top of the standing water, and it will detect if any voltage is within the liquid. This is something that I would definitely suggest you do prior to stepping into any standing water. We're also going to use engineering controls based upon the contaminants that are going to be present. During the remediation or removal activities, contaminants can become aerosolized, as well as within these situations, we're going to have odors that are present. So air filtration devices, or the acronym that's listed here, AFD, it's suggested that we insert or use these engineering controls with activated carbon. The activated carbon is going to assist in removing the odors, whether they're placed in recirculation mode, acting as an air scrubber within the affected structure, or if it's acting as a negative air machine, which means that it's exhausting the air out of the contaminated environment, and we recommend that this goes to the exterior. We'll definitely use these in adjacent areas to the affected spaces, and this is going to vary depending upon the structure which is going to be remediated. But an odor control or an air filtration device with an activated carbon filter can definitely be used for odor control. I've put this slide and the next slide in bold print. Work practice controls, we definitely have the most control over. This is something that we are doing ourselves. This is something as a company, as an occupant, as a volunteer, I can't stress this enough, and this is going to directly affect our health as an individual. We want to establish a cleaning station. You want to establish a cleaning station definitely outside of the structure, near the workspace. You may be working in structures or in environments or in locations where you can also establish an additional cleaning station within the structure. This is going to be in any area that has not been directly affected by the contaminated water source. It's important to have hot water available. Now, I know in these situations, power is probably going to be limited, something that I've done in the past so that I can heat the water. It does take some time, but we can create or make hot water by using a microwave and a generator if available. You want to have hand soap as well as hand sanitizer available. It's important to have disinfectant wipes. It's also important to have alcohol-based hand wipes. In the environments that you're working, you can assist in making or determining your appropriate break schedule. If you use the OSHA heat safety tool, OSHA states that in these environments, when you're wearing protective gear, such as your hooded and booted protective clothing, as well as a respiratory item, a respirator item, that you determine an appropriate break schedule. We want to be sure that we're drinking plenty of bottled water. It's important also that you seek medical attention. I put this, I've indicated this, and this is for all injuries. Medical attention can vary anywhere from going to a first aid kit to, depending upon the severity, to a medical facility. But any cuts or abrasions, as minimal as they might seem to an individual because of the extent of the potential of the contamination, it's definitely important that you seek the appropriate medical attention for whatever injury it might be. And then probably most obvious that you see here in a typical project scenario would be shower at the end of each work day. This is to reduce the amount of contamination that a person may be taking on to their body in or around the work site. I've pointed this out specifically because I know that this can sometimes be difficult. So if any individual is going to be looking to respond to this, this is something that I would strongly take into consideration as you prepare to respond to any of these types of categories of losses. Additional work practice controls can be found by going to OSHA.gov, and then you could do it in their keyword search. Type in OSHA fact sheets, and you can find additional helpful information that I'm sure can assist you in preparing for your response to these types of projects. When we're cleaning and sanitizing, We want to use only EPA registered products. It's important that when we are using these products, we document the use and the application. There are some states that require this. I've indicated this here just as a recommendation because either you're working out of state or you're working in state, but it's also helpful, or it's always helpful, excuse me, that we document the use and the application. And you may always already be doing this as well. All the equipment and the tools that are going to be used for inspection and the remediation procedures, including but not limited to, and then we have a list here. This is your measuring devices. Measuring devices can include your just simple tape measures to a laser type measuring device to any type of perhaps walking stick or your wheel sticks. Any item that's used in the inspection process definitely needs to be wiped down and cleaned and decontaminated. I've also included here with the age of technology, as well as any other documentation devices that might be used. We might be out on a project, we're carrying these around, we inadvertently set these on a contaminated space, we pick these up, we set them back in our vehicle, we pick it up, and whatever it came in contact, we can definitely be contaminated just by that simple transmission of just basically setting that device or that documentation device down on a surface that was directly contaminated. Reusable PPE needs to be cleaned and decontaminated. I put in parentheses here a couple examples. Hard hats can be cleaned, decontaminated, reused, depending upon the hand protection of what's being used. If your exterior gloves, the cut resistant gloves, depending upon the level of contamination, it's important that we use common sense on whether we discard these or we reuse these items. But anything that can be reused needs to be cleaned and decontaminated prior to it being stored, because if we handle this outside of the contaminated environment, whether it's a person protective item or a measuring device or an electronic tablet or any other type of documentation device, it doesn't take much of the contamination that is left behind, so to speak, that can cause or result in illness to the individual. This is also going to include air movers, dehumidifiers, and drying equipment. I recommend that you clean these after each use. As you take them from one job to another, this is something that in a rush of events, I'm sure is difficult to get to, but cleaning these is only going to help their performance. And the performance is what we need from these mechanical devices. So be sure that you're cleaning them and decontaminating them before we move them from one location to another, before we move them from a work site. It's also important before we move them or perhaps place them into a truck. Now, I have seen in situations where you remove them perhaps from a job site, we place them into a transport vehicle, and then in a controlled area, we're going to clean down the equipment as well as the transport vehicle. Any of the above, it would be sufficient. So as long as we're cleaning and sanitizing and keeping in mind the level of contamination to those items. We need to have an identified first aid station on site, whether that's a tenant area, whether that's just simply a first aid kit. But because of the medical attention that needs to be, in some cases, prescribed, whether it's just simply flushing out a cut or an abrasion and putting on the proper ointment and a Band-Aid, the first aid station and any details that goes along with that needs to be identified and located as well. Something that I'm hoping is just obvious to most individuals, however sometimes it's not, is we don't want to use a generator indoors. You also don't want to use your generator in a garage. You also want to be aware of where you're placing that generator. If it's outside of perhaps an open window, the carbon monoxide that is a result can definitely come into the atmosphere, and that's something that we definitely don't want to mess with. So you want to place your generators out away from the structure in an area maybe perhaps downwind of the structure, so that those gases, that carbon monoxide, is less likely or not likely to enter into the workspace or into the indoor environment. Fuel is something that is going to be a necessity as well. So we want to be sure that we have and are following the proper storage for any type of fuel. Moving on to your microbial awareness, and this is one of the specific or main reasons why it's important that we clean, decontaminate, and that we're using the appropriate personal protective equipment. As I stated when we began the presentation, this is just your basic awareness. More information or additional information can be provided to you. You have the questions, I'll do the best I can to assist in answering those. Your exposure, the primary manner in which that you can be affected by this type of contaminant is ingested or ingestion. You're literally ingesting the contamination. Terminology that has been used for that or can be used for that, you might reference or have seen this. It's literally listed as fecal oral contact. So in other words, it's just hand to mouth. You're touching a contaminated surface, a contaminated item that is contaminated with bacteria. Then you're going to your eyes, you're going to your ears, you're going to your nose, you're going to your mouth. You're directly ingesting that contamination. We can also have an exposure based upon inhalation, dermal exposure, and then a direct exposure through the cuts and abrasions. This is why it's important for the dermal. We want to wear the personal protective equipment, the suit, the hooded and booted suit. Inhalation and ingestion, we recommend that it's a full face respirator. You may see that there's some publications stating that an N95 would be acceptable. I want to make note of that the N95 in terms or what they're referencing is when you have minimal amounts of contamination. Individuals and companies alike that are responding to this extent of contamination should definitely consider using full face respirators with the proper respiratory protection. Different types of bacteria. Tetanus is a specific type of bacteria. This is an immunization that you can definitely receive prior to engaging into any of these services. The symptoms, if you're affected by this bacteria, it's going to directly affect the nervous system. Individual can result in muscle spasm. E. coli, Salmonella, Shigella, these are 3 common bacteria that will likely be present in the contaminated water source. The symptoms of this will be stomach ache, fever, vomiting, diarrhea, and it doesn't take a significant amount, so a small amount of any of these bacteria can definitely affect a person. To be affected by this, E. coli, Salmonella, Shigella, this is the hand to mouth. This is the fecal oral contact. This is when you're touching a contaminated surface and then you're going to a point of ingestion. This is why it's important that if, let's say you're wearing your large cuffed nitrile gloves and you have your tablet or you have your inspection devices, you have your laser tape, and you're, I'm sure, coming in contact with contaminated surfaces. We have contamination now on our inspection devices. We have contamination now on our gloves. If we are not washing our hands, we're not decontaminating those items, that bacteria can set on those items that have now come in contact with those contaminated surfaces. They could just be there. They could be there. They could be dormant, just waiting for a person to affect an individual. So we want to make sure, and that's the reason why I listed there, to decontaminate any of those items during the inspection process. Viruses include hepatitis A. It's identified as a liver disease. The symptoms with this, if you're affected by hepatitis A, would be jaundiced skin, eyes, dark urine, fatigue, loss of appetite. Hepatitis A, the symptoms of this isn't something that is going to show up until after a few weeks. The symptoms of this is going to be shown or make known after a period of time. Whereas with the bacteria, and we're going to speak of parasites, the bacteria and the parasites, you can have within 24 hours, 48 hours or less, these symptoms begin to show up. With viruses, where your results or your the symptoms will be nausea, vomiting, fever, and abdominal pain. Specific parasites that are likely or can be present within the contaminated water sources include Cryptosporidium and Giardia. This is going to be in the drinking water. So in the water that the wells that I've read that are likely contaminated, the treatment plants that I'm sure are contaminated, there are reports now that they're asking that the water be boiled, and that's because of the likely concern of parasites as well as other pathogens that might be in the drinking water. My advice to you is bring plenty of bottled water. Bring your own water. Have your own water. I would not, until everything has gone back to normal, until the city or until the municipality in which you're working, until they deem it safe, I would use bottled water and any water that you might be bringing in. So I wouldn't drink it, nor would I use it to clean or decontaminate any of your tools, devices, inspection devices, or PPE. Symptoms that can result when you're affected by a parasite include diarrhea, stomach pain, as well as lack of appetite. Additional symptoms include weight loss, bloating, nausea, vomiting, slight fever, and fatigue. Your initial symptoms are going to be your nausea, vomiting, slight fever, fatigue. Some of these symptoms can definitely be confused or can be confused just simply with working in the environment. This is why it's important to develop a work schedule perhaps, and just simply be alerted to any potential symptoms that yourself or your employees might be showing. Bloodborne pathogens can also be present within the contaminated water source. If you feel that you are concerned, or that if there is a concern of being affected by any bloodborne pathogens such as HIV, hepatitis B, or hepatitis C, it's important that you seek medical attention basically right away. Other potential hazards that can definitely be found in the contaminated water can include lead, arsenic, as well as other chemicals. And that's just going to be dependent upon what the environment is, what the direct environment is around the place at which you are working. So the chemicals can definitely vary. This is something based upon your workspace or based upon the area in which you're working that you are alerted to or aware of. If you feel that you're affected by any of these, it's also important that you seek medical attention. Other hazards, I mentioned this briefly, definitely is going to be more common because we're wearing the PPE. It's going to protect us in most cases from the bacteria. We're donning and doffing it properly. We are decontaminating our PPE. We're decontaminating our inspection and tools and equipment. So most likely what's going to affect an individual is going to be heat stress. If it extends to heat stroke, this is much more severe. So we want to have an individual in place that's monitoring and developing an appropriate break schedule so that we prevent the possibilities of heat stress. Heat stress is not as severe as heat stroke. If an individual is suffering from the symptoms of heat stroke, then you would definitely want to have them seek medical attention for them. Carbon monoxide, this is from the gas generators. So in terms of the health and safety, as we mentioned, do not use these inside. We do not want to place them in a garage or use them near a window that could be opened. To summarize the health and safety, 5 measures that I've taken here: clean and decontaminate and sanitize. This is extremely important. If you're to take anything away from this, this is what's I would say is extremely important. We want to take adequate breaks so that we could reduce the potential of heat stress or heat stroke. We always want to wear the appropriate PPE. This goes hand in hand with clean, decontaminate, and sanitize. We want to establish and maintain proper work practice controls. Being prepared for these situations prior to going out to a project, communicating with your technicians or workers, whoever might be involved in the project. It's important that they understand and that they maintain these work practice controls, and that would be specifically to your cleaning station, the station, and the procedures that you're going to follow or should be followed when cleaning and decontaminating coming out of a work environment or a contaminated environment. Make use of any needed engineering controls, and these are going to vary based upon the project, whether it's containment, the use of a negative air machine, odor control, the placement or the use of an air scrubber. If it's a partial project or a partial structure that's affected versus an entire structure that might be affected, the variable will be dependent upon the project. Moving on to cleanup and removal. It's important that we complete the procedures for the ANSI IICRC S500 and the ANSI IICRC S520. These publications can both be purchased by going to Restoration Technical Institute's website. They have a link that can be provided to you as you scroll down towards the bottom of their website. A link directly to the purchase of those publications can be found. Any licensing requirements shall be followed for the projects involving mold. It's important that you do have current licensing, certifications, insurance, whatever your state requires, that you have that going into just to perform the services that are not involving mold contamination. My recommendation to you, if you are involving a project or prior to involving any project, because I've seen recent publication that in 2015, they actually stated that in events such as these, that additional certification or additional licensing specific to the emergency event will not require specific Texas licensing. But I did not see in that legislation anything that would not require you to have any licensing specific as what they have in Texas regarding mold. So that's something that you might want to make note of if you're out on a project and you find mold contamination. Are you still required to be in compliance with those requirements as listed in the Texas legislation? For cleanup and removal, this is a typical sequence. We identify this. This can also be found in the S520 for dealing with sewage contaminated or heavily contaminated workspaces or environments. It's 7 steps that we follow. We can add to these. We don't want to take away from these steps. Some of this may be less. Some of these steps may be more. It's just going to be dependent upon each project on a case-by-case basis. First and foremost, we want to identify the health and care for the health and safety for the worker as well as the occupant. So we want to identify any health and safety concerns. We want to identify and eliminate the source. I place the asterisk by these next 3. If we arrive to a project and there's standing water, unfortunately, there's probably little work that we can perform in those environments. The water that is going to be pumped out there at that time, likely there's not a location that we can return it to, nor will we have the ability to remove the standing water without additional waters coming in. So this is going to be based upon a job-by-job, case-by-case project. Your containment, again, will be job-specific, whether it's containing the second floor to the main floor, your basement. If we have crawl spaces, there are going to be areas that do have basements. There's going to be areas that do have crawl spaces. Then we're going to have locations or structures that the entire structure is contaminated. In those situations, a containment where it's entirely contaminated will likely not be necessary. To determine if a pressure differential is necessary would be if we have a heavily contaminated environment that's adjacent to or near a non-contaminated environment. And we'll go over each one of these more specifically as we proceed with the presentation. We then finish with the removal, cleaning procedures, and then dependent upon the project, an evaluation and or a verification. With your containment procedures, we want to prevent the contamination from spreading. So as we mentioned, some projects may involve the entire structure. So in these situations, if the entire structure is affected, a containment or a separation is not necessary. A main and second floor, if we have a second floor or a main floor that's affected, let's say that the house or the structure whether it's commercial or residential, if the structure is on a slab. If the main floor is affected, but any floor above that is not, it's definitely important to establish containment between those workspaces. Some of the structures in the affected area may include basements, where the basement is affected, but the remaining structure is not. So we definitely want to establish a containment between those spaces. In some areas, a crawl space is going to be affected. This is the space directly below the living space. We want to establish a containment between the spaces. It's also important when you have a contaminated crawl space that you create a pressure differential. With the pressure differential, in most cases, we will be establishing a negative pressure differential. This is using an air filtration device. We are adding to this, if necessary, a carbon filter, and you're exhausting the air out of the contaminated space. This air that's being exhausted out of the contaminated space should be exhausted to the exterior. We can also, in the adjacent non-contaminated areas or after the removal of the contaminated materials, we can place air scrubbers. This will be dependent upon the project. These air scrubbers will add the carbon filters or activated carbon filters as needed. This will assist in the odor control. The removal, prior to removal and based upon your inspection, we need to be in compliance with anything that might be dealing with lead-based paint or asbestos-containing materials. I've put an asterisk by these dates. 1978 for lead-based paint, asbestos-containing material, or ACM, that's an acronym for that, is 1980. There is some variance to this depending upon the region in which you live. I would make note to this, especially regarding the asbestos-containing materials, that you're definitely in compliance with this. This is a regulated material. It's federally regulated, and so your federal regulations are going to supersede anything that you're doing within the state of Texas. All porous materials directly in contact with the flood water should be removed. This is going to include your non-structural finishings and contents. I made a list here. This is not to be all-inclusive, but I definitely have provided some items that are likely going to be encountered, which include drywall. Drywall, when it's directly affected, it should be removed. Insulation, anything that's directly affected or comes in contact with the insulation should be removed. Baseboards, door trim, interior door jambs, or interior doors, and the jambs as well. We need to evaluate the exterior doors in regards to the jambs or the doors themselves needing to be removed on the exterior. The carpet and cushion, wood finish flooring, any additional finished flooring should be removed. The underlayment that's over the top of the subfloor. And then I summarize this, the last bullet point, based upon the project. Essentially, if it's porous, it's absorbed the contaminated water source, it's affected, therefore it should be removed. All semi-porous materials that are directly in contact with the flooded water source should be evaluated per the extent of the damage. Semi-porous, depending upon the severity or depending upon the time of the loss in which it was submerged or which it was affected, we need to evaluate them. So we're going to make the determination based upon the item, based upon the severity of it being affected. We'll make the determination whether or not it should be discarded or cleaned. Your non-porous materials directly in contact with the flood water should be evaluated per the extent of the damage. We can clean these items or we can discard these items. Whether it's a structural material or if it's a content is most cases going to fit into this category. We want to look at the cost of cleaning it versus the cost of replacement. Your structural materials. These are the materials that are remaining after the finished materials such as the drywall, finished flooring, the underlayment, the insulation, baseboards. This is the 2x4s. This is the 3/4 inch subfloor, half-inch subfloor in some situations. These are your floor joists, the sill plates, foundation, This is the skeleton. These are the bones to the commercial space or the residential space. We need to evaluate these to determine the level or the extent of contamination. In some situations, prior to removal, it would definitely be a consideration that you might take into account to use a licensed professional as needed to evaluate prior to removal of any structural materials. These materials in most cases, or in some cases, can be load-bearing. We definitely don't want to be removing any load-bearing structural materials during the remediation process. Your HVAC systems and mechanicals, they should be evaluated. We can, dependent upon the specific state requirements, we can perform an inspection. We can identify or assist in identifying potentially the level or the extent of the contamination. But what I'm specifically regarding here when I say use a licensed professional, the mechanics of it, the ability for it to work. Will this item, will the HVAC system, will any of the mechanicals within the structure function if it's left in place after the decontamination, after the cleaning, after the restoration process is complete? So this is something that should definitely be evaluated at some point in the remediation procedure. Your cleaning. Pre-cleaning is extremely important on these types of losses. Antimicrobial uses is acceptable. For the antimicrobial to be most effective, pre-cleaning should definitely be established. Follow-up of the pre-clean procedures is going to make or allow for the efficacy of the antimicrobial to be more acceptable. With your pre-cleaning procedures, we want to remove all debris. I've listed here using an adequate vacuum, whether that's a HEPA vacuum, portable vacuums. Again, it's dependent upon the circumstance. And then essentially a broom. When we're using a broom device, I always recommend a good broom. We want to control when we're using this broom. We want to perform a controlled removal or a clean, pre-clean process when we're using the vacuum as well. In your pre-clean procedures, two options that can be used depending upon the severity of the loss is high pressure or low pressure flushing. This is going to be applied or can be used on the exposed structural materials. This is your framing. This could be used in construction for residential as well as commercial. It's important that during these procedures, whether you're high pressure flushing or low pressure flushing, that you follow up in a controlled manner with the extraction process. If we continue to flush and use these pressure washing devices without proper extraction, there's a pretty good possibility that we could spread contamination from one location to another. So we want to do this in a controlled manner and follow up basically immediately with your extraction process. We can carefully low pressure flush all surfaces. This is a process that is recommended if you have remaining materials. So if we go into an environment, and you may have seen or you may be performing where you're going in and you're doing a 4-foot flood cut, the water was either standing within the structure at 3 or 4 feet and you're removing materials to that water line. There are remaining finished materials within the structure, so a low pressure flushing has a lower PSI. It's recommended within the standard that it be within 20 to 60 PSI. And the idea behind this is so that contamination is not splashing onto the non-contaminated or remaining materials within the structure. It's also recommended that you use hot water. This is something that might be difficult to come by, so you want to make note of this. Any type of pressure device or flushing device, you want to have the capability to add or heat the water. We're going to use this process to assist in flushing out the contaminants from below the bottom plates or the sill plates. The bottom plate or the sill plate is the structural component that is in contact with either the concrete slab floor or the wood subfloor. This is what the wall is built on top of. Again, we're going to follow this directly with an extraction device. We're going to repeat this process as needed. We can complete the flushing and rinsing and extraction process multiple applications or multiple times prior to an application of a antimicrobial biocide. With your high pressure flushing, we'll complete this process when all of the finishing materials have been removed. This is sometimes referred to as a full cut. So when you walk into a structure and you see nothing but framing, you see nothing on the ceiling, there's nothing remaining on the walls, the 2x4s are exposed. You might see some electro outlets. Obviously, if we're using or performing any of these services, we want to ensure that the electrical has been shut down or is off if it is not already turned off or has been shut down. Just as we do with the low pressure flushing, we want to use hot water. We're going to flush the contaminants from the material, from the 2x4, from the structural materials, as well as from below the bottom plates. Just as we do with the low pressure flushing, ensure that you're following directly up with an extraction device, and then we repeat these procedures as needed. Essentially, this is something that I do is a visual inspection. When your water that you're flushing or that you're adding to the contaminated surfaces, when that water becomes or starts to become clear or is clear, that's a pretty good indication that you have sufficiently removed the contaminants from the structure, or is to a level that you can do with the pressure washing or pressure flushing. The structure materials that are going to be left behind after the pre-cleaning with the flushing and the rinsing, additional methods that can be used to assist in removing the contamination would be a foaming machine. The use of a foaming machine also with agitational scrub brushing or agitating the surfaces will definitely assist in removing any additional pathogens or contaminants that might remain within the materials. Steam cleaning is something that may also be commonly used or can be used. Steam cleaning or foam machine usage is going to be on a case-by-case basis. You'll make the determination. This is something that as you move forward, if you're on a project, you can always definitely send those inquiries or those specific questions to Lisa or Steve or myself. With your antimicrobials, after the pre-clean procedure, your antimicrobial can be used. We do not want to mix products. I capitalize this. This is in bold font. We do not want to mix the products. We want to use EPA registered products. With bleach, bleach is probably something that is going to be recommended first and foremost. We don't want to use this prior to pre-cleaning. Bleach is not a disinfectant. It's going to be inactivated by organic matter. So any application of the bleach is not going to render you any benefit. It can also be very corrosive to the metal. So if you're in a commercial space or in a space where you have metal plating, electrical wiring can definitely be corrosive. We want to provide a chemical consent as needed, apply according to label instructions, and use the appropriate PPE. The bullet points that I provided here is going to be based upon the antimicrobial selection that is chosen to be used. The recovered rinse water or any water that is extracted during the pre-cleaning or any procedures needs to be returned or shall be returned to a sanitary drain. It can also be hauled away by bulk waste truck or per local regulations. The remaining materials after the application of the biocide and cleaning should be dried. They should be returned to EMC. This stands for equilibrium moisture content, or whatever your established dry standard has been identified to be. The drying procedures should be followed per the ANSI IICRC S500. Additional cleaning procedures after successfully achieving EMC may be necessary. It's important that in these cleaning procedures you use minimal moisture so as not to add or elevate the moisture content of those materials. After the cleaning of said contaminated materials and environments or locations, verification testing by a third party can be performed. This is when they'll come in and perform sampling procedures or an evaluation. These procedures should be listed with any type of work authorization or scope of work. Whether at the end of a project, verification is going to be completed or an evaluation. Evaluation will be completed by the contractor or individual performing the work, and this is based upon a visual inspection. Essentially, it looks clean, smells clean. We successfully completed the procedures as outlined. When we're choosing a contractor, fairly simple on this. My recommendations would be that they obviously are licensed and insured. License meaning the state that they have, they're carrying a license within the state that they're performing services. In addition to this, I recommend that they have specific certifications such as the AMRT, which is the Applied Microbial Remediation Technician, as well as the WRT, that stands for the Water Restoration Technician. These are both IICRC certifications. IICRC certified firm I put next to this question mark. This is something that I see misused often. Just because an individual or a company is a certified firm doesn't necessarily equate that they have these specific designations. An additional certification also might be an ASD, which is the Applied Structural Drying, but to have that course, you would definitely need the WRT because it is the prerequisite. Thank you. That concludes my presentation. I appreciate everyone's time. I've noted here the website, Restoration Technical Institute's website, Lisa's name, as well as her email. Should you have any future questions, definitely make note of that. So I'll open it up to anyone that might have questions.
Destry, this is Lisa. I want to thank you so much. That was so thorough and educational, and I think it'll be a great value to anybody who's looking for some direction and guidance on these types of handling these jobs and keeping themselves safe. So thank you very much.
You bet. Thank you, Lisa.
So at that point, we will sign off. And like Destry said, you can contact us at through our website, follow us on Facebook, and feel free to send any follow-up emails or questions, and we will get you some answers. Thank you all.